Senkaku theater is the most dangerous gray zone flashpoint in East Asia for three reasons.
Chinese maneuver in this region is, the more assertive and self-righteous. And sometimes, China tries to use the international rules selectively.
France is a resident power in the Indo-Pacific, and there are questions of sovereignty, but our preoccupations goes far beyond that.
China would eventually use force not only in the South China Sea, but more significantly, of course, in the other flashpoint.
Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are located right now. I hope that all of you have made a good kickstart of the new year. Welcome to RIPS webinar on East Asian maritime security and Japan's territorial integrity. Thank you very much for joining us today. Fortunately, we have 4 prominent speakers and 3 leading experts for this event. I'd like to introduce today's speakers in the speaking order. First, Admiral Yoji Koda, former Commander-in-Chief of Self-Defense Fleet of Maritime Self-Defense Force or Japan Navy. And second, Dr. Valérie Niquet of the Foundation for Strategic Research of France. And third, Professor James Kraska of the U.S. Naval War College. And fourth, Professor Renato Cruz de Castro of De La Salle University of the Philippines. So much for my lengthy introduction. And now, Admiral Koda, you have 8 minutes. The floor is all yours. Admiral Koda, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Tokuchi. I'm Yoji Koda, former old sailor and age of a little more than 75 years old. China has been in a good way and bad ways, a challenger to the kind of the established, the international rule or maritime the practice. So I'd like to focus more on China than other nations. And one clear thing is, that when we deal with China, there is always the one big problem in Asia or East Asia, because each nation in East Asia or coastal nations of the South China Sea and East China Sea, each nation's geographic, the group that have been following a kind of the Western-based, the maritime order, the China looked like also the challenger to the established international norm. So there is and will be a kind of the friction between the Chinese schools and also the traditional, the Western schools. Chinese maneuver in this region is, the more assertive and self-righteous. And sometimes China tries to use the international rules selectively, use the international rules. If those established international rules support the Chinese position, China would implement those, the rule. But in some cases, and many cases, established Chinese maneuver in our area do not support Chinese position. In that case, China says, we are not under this rule, but we are out of, and we are maneuvering under our own, Chinese own, the norms or maritime norms. So that makes our, the situation or the policy very difficult. So those are my observation that happened during last 20 years period.
So, as we all know, and as has always been explained by Admiral Koda, maritime security in the Indo-Pacific has become a central issue in today's international security environment. And this is not only because of the region's strategic geography, but also because of the methods increasingly used by China to pursue its objectives at sea. China's reliance on gray zone tactics, coercive actions deliberately designed to remain below the threshold of open armed conflict, poses a structural challenge to regional stability, international maritime law, and political decision-making in neighboring states. From a European perspective, including that of France, these developments matter well beyond geography. As you know, France is a resident power in the Indo-Pacific, and there are questions of sovereignty, but our preoccupations goes far beyond that. Europe is economically, politically, and normatively invested in the stability of Indo-Pacific sea lanes and in the preservation of a rules-based maritime order. Understanding gray zone tactics and dynamics is therefore essential, not optional. Rather than seeking rapid escalation or decisive confrontation, Beijing advances its objective step by step, carefully managing escalation risk. Gray zone tactics beyond the threshold of the respect for the rule of law, allow China to alter facts on the ground, or rather at sea, while maintaining ambiguity and avoiding direct military conflict. They form a structural and enduring component of China's maritime strategy and are a constant challenge to international rule of law. The assertion of sovereignty in contested maritime spaces, particularly the South China Sea and the East China Sea, is a core objective. But the scope of China's gray zone strategy extends much further. These tactics aim to deter resistance by raising the political and operational cost of countermeasures, complicate crisis management through legal and strategic ambiguity, like improved analytical recognition of gray zone coercion, political and diplomatic support of partners, selective operational presence in line with international law, and of course, constantly reassert the fundamental principles of rules-based international law. Such engagement reflects a concern for stability, predictability, and coherence in the international maritime order. To conclude, China's use of gray zone tactics in the maritime domain represents a long-term strategic challenge. For Japan, this challenge is immediate and operational. For European actors, it raises broader questions about the resilience of the rules-based maritime order. Thank you very much.
Thank you kindly, Takuchi-san, and thank you to the Research Institute for Peace and Security for the invitation. I'll just talk a little bit about the nature and evolution of China's gray zone and maybe conclude with some things that might be effective in countering it. So China's gray zone strategy is deliberate, it's centrally directed, and it's designed to achieve de facto control of strategic maritime space without crossing the threshold or large-scale kinetic conflict. The operational template that China has employed is remarkably consistent across theaters. This includes employment of irregular forces such as the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia operating in concert with the China Coast Guard and the PLA Navy. These include, of course, systemic violations of collision regulations through dangerous maneuvers, water cannon, military-grade lasers, and weaponization of domestic law, including the 2021 China Coast Guard law, to assert extraterritorial jurisdiction inside the EEZs of neighboring states. I would suggest that the Senkaku Islands is the central front of this campaign, not the South China Sea, actually. The Senkaku Theater is the most dangerous gray zone flashpoint in East Asia for three reasons. First of all, there's unmistakable legal clarity. The islands are indisputably under Japanese administration and are part of Japanese territory, and both the Law of the Sea Convention, as it's practiced, as well as the Okinawa Reversion Agreement, place them within Japan's territory and control, and the waters are, of course, under Japan's sovereignty and sovereign rights and jurisdiction. So here's where China's historic claims are the most threatening, and these, of course, were rejected by the arbitration in 2016. The second dimension to this that makes it the central front are the strategic stakes, because Japan is the linchpin for security for all of East Asia. That is, for the states in the South China Sea, as well as for the United States, Australia, even Korea. So this is the central front, and control of the Senkaku Islands would push the Japan and U.S. defensive perimeter 300 nautical miles eastward. It would fracture the first island chain in a way that only the invasion of Taiwan would do so. And it would place Chinese Navy SSBN bastions in the Philippine Sea under direct observation or control. So in short, both Taiwan and the Senkaku Islands would dissolve the wall of U.S.-Japan security that half the world depends upon. And indeed, it would place China on the American border of Guam, as well as, of course, undermine Australia and New Zealand defense through encroachment in Oceania. So it would be quite a disaster. The third reason are the escalatory dynamics. Since 2012, China has maintained a near continuous China Coast Guard presence inside the contiguous zone of the Senkaku Islands. Last year, it was 357 days. They continue to operate with large 10,000 plus ton former Navy vessels that are reflagged as Coast Guard vessels, as well as PLAN intelligence gathering ships in the area. So the Senkaku Islands reflects the broader East Asian pattern. So why is China effective with gray zone tactics? It's because there's an asymmetry of political will. Democratic states are inclined to rule of law norms, and they're also inclined to de-escalation. de-escalation. And this allows China to manipulate the threshold because each incident is calibrated to fall below the level that would trigger some sort of concrete response. And it plays into China's dominance of narrative of the three warfares, which is public opinion, psychological, and legal warfare that portrays China as a victim and the other states as provocateurs. And all of this erodes deterrence credibility, and repeated non-responses has trained or licensed Beijing that escalation costs are near zero. So we need to restore those costs or that deterrence. Doing so requires a unity of effort, operational coordination, including, for example, the establishment of combined maritime task forces, such as Japan, US, Philippines, and Australia, would be beneficial. We have avoided that so far. Increasing collective or bilateral or multilateral freedom of navigation and even fishing patrols would be extremely helpful. And also the extension of Japan's bilateral MDA agreements with Vietnam and the Philippines could be turned into trilateral frameworks and inviting more people. In conclusion, what I would suggest is that there is a benefit to take a playbook from the Cold War and begin to insist on normalized engagement with China based upon something like a Copenhagen-like document. The Copenhagen Agreement that the United States and NATO had was promulgated by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in 1994 with the Soviet Union, with Russia. And what it said was that there were minimum norms or expectations that states required in order to maintain effective and constructive diplomatic relations, such as democracy and the rule of law, human rights and fundamental freedoms.
Good evening for those who are in the Asia Pacific region, and good morning to those who are in the East Coast and in Europe. So my presentation today focuses on how the Philippines is, of course, responding to Chinese gray zone operation. And of course, this is in the terms of coming out with a grand strategy called the Comprehensive Archipelagic Defense Concept. This is, of course, based on the recognition that the gray zone operation, from the perspective of the Philippines, from the perspective of the armed forces of the Philippines, is simply a transitory stage before China could eventually use force. So there's no more notion that China would simply rely on gray zone operation, on simply remaining at what we call at the the threshold before you have the actual use of force. Rather, this is perceived as a stage before China, of course, would eventually use force. The goal, of course, is to weaken the national morale and to create division among allies before, of course, China would eventually use force not only in the South China Sea, but more significantly, of course, in the other flashpoint on the Coast Guard, the shadowing approach or harassment. Actually, we are already perceiving. In fact, the pronouncement of the current spokesperson of the Philippine Navy, Rear Admiral Roy Trinidad, said that the Philippine Navy and the armed forces of the Philippines are starting to see not only presence, but consistent presence that might lead to the actual use of force against the Philippine Coast Guard and possibly against the Philippine Navy. So the comprehensive archipelagic concept has the following components. Number one, of course, it entails a change in the outlook, shifting away from the focus on the island, shifting into, of course, the 200-mile exclusive economic zone. China is doing as much as possible to isolate us from the other ASEAN member states, given, of course, the fact that the Philippines will be the host of the ASEAN, this is 2026. And again, this is a reality we have to face. We have our national interests we have to protect, despite the fact that among the other ASEAN member countries, we are in a way isolated by the fact that we are the only one that has an active territorial dispute with China, and in a way developing our capabilities for a push comes to shove situation, not only in the South China Sea, but also in Taiwan. I end my presentation here. Thank you very much for your attention.